Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar BPMN for business analysts. Today, for the first time, we'll be using experimentally Hangouts on Air, so in case of any problems, please let me know and I'll try to improve our setup. During session today, we'll begin with a brief introduction. Then I'll answer the questions from the registration that you ask about how to use BPMN when you're a business analyst, and then we'll have a time for Q&A session if you have any more questions. We are using, as I told you, Hangouts on Air, so if you wish, you can go to the YouTube site and there's a widget with comments where you can ask any questions you wish, and then I'll be answering your questions. So I think we may begin. I see that there is a small lag on the presentation, but I hope it will be okay. So I'll try to avoid doing rapid changes. Okay. So let's go. As I told you, we'll start with a brief introduction. During the session today, I'll be using Adonis Community Edition. This is a free tool that you can use both for modeling your processes for internal purposes, but also for doing consulting, for doing trainings, for teaching others, BPMN, business analysis, whatever you wish. This is a free tool with full support for professional BPM scenarios. So what I'll be showing you today is only a very small subset of the features, and the tool has over 75,000 users worldwide. You can learn more and download at adoniscommunity.com. Our company, BOC Group, that is behind Adonis Community, offers both software tools, but also services, especially for business process management. Those of you who are using Mac computers can be interested in using our cloud solution, Adonis Cloud. This is a pure browser-based service that allows you to model in BPMN, but not only, and do much more. And it offers a 30-day free trial. So if you just want to experiment with BPMN, see how does it work, you can freely use the solution. If you're more on the IT side, you may also want to take a look at our EIM tool, Enterprise Architecture Management, called AdoIT Community. It is also 100% free, so if you're more technically inclined, you may find it interesting. During this webinar, we'll focus on modeling processes with BPMN. But obviously, this is not everything. If you'd like to learn more about process documentation, about simulating your processes, about executing them on, well, execution engines, you can go to our site, and there in the chapter Webinars and Tutorials, you can find recordings of the past webinars. We'll be also preparing the new webinars, so stay tuned. Okay, for this webinar, I have two groups of questions. The first is rather specific: how to translate a business process as is using the proper symbols into the process flow diagram, so into the business process diagram. So this is the question that I will start with. And the second group of questions that you have sent me, there were various about intermediate events, about other stuff, but I decided to group it. Basically, it can be reduced to what are the more sophisticated additional BPMN elements and when you should use them. And this is something I'll cover in the second part of our session today. Of course, this is a huge block. I could spend several hours telling you about more sophisticated BPMN elements in detail, but I'll try to focus on showing you only the most useful ones, only the ones that you can really use daily, especially if you're doing business process analysis. So this is something that we'll start with. After this part, that should take about 20 to 30 minutes, we'll have time for the Q&A. So if you'll have any more specific questions, simply go to our YouTube channel and then using the link that you're using to watch it, you can ask me questions like the ones that you can see here. Okay, so let's begin. BPMN allows you to create process diagrams that allow you to understand better what is happening inside your organization. Of course, this is not everything. Apart from BPMN diagrams, which are standard, you can also extend your description to other aspects. I'll cover some of them later on. Those aspects can be process architecture, can be list of resources such as roles, such as IT systems, such as documents, all the elements which are not 100% covered in BPMN, but are nonetheless very, very useful. So those are elements that I'll introduce later on. Let's begin with the basics. So why should you care about BPMN if you're a business process analyst or simply business analyst? BPMN, which stands for Business Process Modeling Notation, is a kind of common language. This is an OMG standard, so coming from the organization that stands behind the UML and many, many other useful standards. It gives you nice possibilities. You can use the training providers from anywhere. You can learn BPMN from books, from the courses on Udemy or wherever you wish. There is a BPMN DI, so open standard for sharing your diagrams with others. This is something I'll cover later on. Since this is governed by OMG, there is a guarantee that it will be constantly developed and maintained, and there are no costs behind using BPMN. So it is a good idea to start thinking about BPMN if you're worried about flowcharts that are not understood by others perfectly, if you're not happy with using some proprietary notation, or if you just want to use the latest, best ways to depict processes. Well, but first of all, why do we need a standard notation? The answer is obviously because we want to communicate successfully. In each organization, there are many, many initiatives and many groups of people that are somehow interested in processes. There are business users, IT users, business analysts, people interested about compliance, about risks. There are external companies that are doing implementation of IT systems. And if we don't have some common language that allows us to understand better what is the current state and what we are trying to achieve, we risk this problem that you can see here. So we risk that we have a very, very ambitious goal, but we will not achieve it because we cannot talk to each other, because we don't understand. Every group has own language and they don't understand one another. So IT may use the UML diagrams, business may use the flowcharts, other groups may use other ways of depicting processes, but they are not willing to understand, to use the methods used by others. So the idea is to provide a standard notation that can be used and understood by all interested people. When BPMN was introduced, especially when BPMN 2.0 was introduced, Many people were not very happy with number of objects, of shapes. Overall, there are more than 100 various shapes in BPMN. So some people started joking that BPMN should actually stand for business people may not understand. Of course, as you probably know, not everything from the BPMN is really super useful. You can start with the basic elements that I was already introducing and that I'll introduce one more time in a second, and you'll be perfectly fine. Then you can add more advanced stuff if you need it. So BPMN is complex, contains many objects, but if you focus on the most useful elements, this is not that complicated, and it is something that you can really learn in less than an hour. As with the traffic signs, they may be many signs, but if you understand the basics, you can very easily understand what given sign means. And it is exactly the same with BPMN. There are not that many types of shapes, so if you understand the basic concepts, you will be able to very fast understand. You will be able to understand all of them very quickly. Okay, so let's start with the basics. So how do we model the processes? Analysts community allows you to model processes using business process model and business process diagram BPMN. Obviously, we are interested in the BPMN option. And now, what are the basic elements? The things that you really need to know in order to document your processes. Well, the most basic questions are: how does my process start? What are the process steps? How does it end? And who does what? And all of them are covered by those elements. So we need to know about start events, tasks, subprocesses, gateways, and events, pools, and lanes. Those are the elements that are very useful and that you will be using all the time. Apart from this, there's a token. So something not visible, but a theoretical concept that allows you to understand better how does the process flow. Okay, so let's imagine that we would like to document a simple process of a customer that comes into the bank and wants to make a money transfer. So customer gives the transfer form. Then the bank clerk needs to check the form, check if the funds are available. If the funds are sufficient for doing the transfer, then the transfer is executed. And if not, bank clerk needs to inform the customer about a failed transfer. Here you can see in practice the most basic, the most useful elements of BPMN notation. Now let me switch the tool and very quickly draw it for you. Afterwards, I will show you how you can extend it. So let's move to Adonis community. Okay, sorry, it seems that I hibernated my computer and lost connection to the database, so I'll need to restart it again. Okay, so I have the tool ready, and now I'll create a new diagram and show you the most basic elements. So let's say it will be money transfer handling. I'm using BPMN and I'm saving it. Now I need to fill my process with content. So first thing is, how does my process start? Well, for me, the process start is that I received the money transfer form. So every time you need to create a process diagram, you should start with asking yourself few simple questions. This is based on approach proposed by Bruce Silver, but extended by me on the basis of my experiences with BPM and the tool. So first, before you even touch the pen and paper or modeling tool, ask yourself which processes should be modeled and why exactly do you want to model the processes. Do you model them in order to create a documentation, or maybe you're trying to create an improved version of the process, or maybe you're modeling process that will be automated. Each scenario translates into slightly different ways of modeling, and this way you should first know why are you doing it and then decide how are you going to model. Then you should document your process attributes. So firstly, you should specify what is the goal of your process, who created this process, when was it created. You can do it either adding some attributes to the process. For each model, you can, by right-clicking, add some model attributes. Some of them are BPMN specific. For example, BPMN tells you about process types. By default, process type is none, so not defined. But you can specify whether your process is private, so internal for your own organization, or is your BPMN diagram public, so something that you will share with others, maybe with your business partners, maybe with your contractors, maybe with some IT company that helps you implement some solution. You can also mark whether BPMN diagram is executable or not. If it's executable, then obviously you want to automate it. If not, this is serving purely documentational purposes or helps you improve it. So those are the BPMN attributes. Again, you may, but you don't need to fill them. They're optional. However, it really makes sense to add some most basic information about the goal of your process, about the scope of your process, whether this is as is or to be version of the process. And then, when you're ready, create high-level vision of your process, of a happy path. So, what would work in a perfect world? It would work like this. We would start with specifying what are the participants. Participant is an organization or entity that, well, takes part in a process and controls own elements. So one participant of this process is obviously a customer, and second participant is a bank. Participants are shown as rectangle containers with a marker showing the name. Okay, now we know who are the process participants. Now we need to figure out what is the happy path. So how does it perfectly start and what is the expected end, our happy end, the way that we expect that the process should finish. So obviously, start event for our happy path is that form for the transfer was received from a customer. And then our end event would be that the transfer was successful. So it shows the scope of your process. You see that it starts when the form was received and you see that in my case, I say that the process ends when the transfer was successful. Of course, you could decide otherwise. You could decide that the end event of your process is situation when the customer was informed that the transfer was successful. So it is up to you how do you scope your process, but you should make sure that your start and end events fit your decision about the scope of your process. Okay, now we know what are the start and what are the end events. Now we need to say what are the steps that take place that allow us to move from the start event to the end event. For this purpose, we are using sub-processes, so the rectangles with the plus icon, if this is something more complex, or tasks if this is something more atomic. Let's assume that we'd like to specify that we check the form, which is something a bit more complex that we don't want to describe here in detail, but we may create a special submodel where we'll cover it. So here the sub-process shows that something more complex takes place when we do check the form. And when we check the form, so for example, we know that the signatures are okay, that the account numbers are okay, and everything is fine, we need to check whether we have whether the customer has the funds. So here I'm using task. Since this is something atomic, rather simple, something that we don't want to divide further, this is normal task. So rectangle with no plus marker. And then, since this is a happy path, we assume that we simply execute the transfer. So on a most basic level, your approach for creating BPMN diagrams is like this. First, you start with figuring out what are the participants. Then, you think about the happy path of your process. So when does it start? And when does it end? What is the end state? And the first one is your, obviously, start event. So the circle with a single thin line, and your end event is marked as a circle with a single thick line. Please make sure that your names are proper. So start and end events depict the state of reality. So this is transfer form received, transfer successful, not something that you do, something that happened. And on the contrary, the steps of your process, so sub-processes and tasks are active. So check the funds, execute the transfer. So this is something that you're doing. Ideally, you should have no more than 5 to 9 elements, so tasks and sub-processes on your happy path. Otherwise, you may end up with very, very big models that are not very easy to understand. Of course, rarely we have the comfort of having very small processes with only 5 or 9 process steps, but you should try to start with the limited number of objects, and then when you extend the happy path model, then we'll add more objects and the model will be bigger. But as a rule of thumb, you can say that the model should contain not more than 30 objects overall, because the bigger it is, the harder it is to understand, and your models should be as clear as possible. If you need to hide some complexity, you can simply use the sub-process and then depict the content of this element in a separate model. Okay, now we already have the happy path. Now you should try to figure out what are the alternative flows. So what are the exceptions? What can go wrong? What are the different ways of handling, of working? Well, obviously, there are many things that can go wrong in this process. Something can go wrong while we're checking the form. When we check the funds, it may happen that the customer doesn't have the sufficient funds. So for this purpose, we'll use gateways to mark that we can behave in a different way. Okay, for this purpose, I'll extend the pool a bit and add a gateway. Gateways are always diamonds. They may contain markers inside or not. There are basically several types of gateways. In Adonis, they are divided into non-exclusive and exclusive gateways. Exclusive gateways or XOR gateways show you that only one of the subsequent paths can be selected. Non-exclusive allow you to show inclusive situation or parallel paths, so situation where all the paths are selected. Here, in this case, we are obviously using exclusive because either we have the funds or we don't have them. So we put the gateway inside. And then we ask the question and the answers are on the lines. So this path is a yes. And if we don't have the funds, then we'll need to inform the customer. So this is no path. And what we need to do here is inform the customer. If you're modeling alternative flows, please make sure that you name properly end states of each path. This end event marks the success. Here we need to specify the failure, so how this process can fail. Well, in this case, transfer was not successful because there were not sufficient funds. So our end state could be transfer failed, no funds. If you'd like to be super precise, we could state that actually the end state of this process is not only that the transfer failed due to not sufficient funds, but also that the customer was informed about the situation. But for this brief presentation, we don't need to be super strict. Okay, now we can much more easily show what happens inside the process. Even if you don't look at the content, but only see the start and end events, you can quickly figure out that the transfer can either end successfully or can fail due to insufficient funds. So it shows you very easily and very clearly what can happen inside the process. Okay, now we can extend the model if needed and link it with resources and link it with other elements. These are the most basic elements. So start events, end events, tasks, gateways, and sub-processes. This is not very complicated. But of course, BPMN allows you to have much more meaning inside your diagrams. For example, if you would like to show that there is some collaboration between the customer and the bank, you can also mark it. The whole process flow is marked with this arrow. This is a sequence flow. This is an arrow with a filled arrowhead, and it shows how does the process flow. At the beginning, I told you about the token. Token is not visible in any way, but this is a theoretical concept that allows you to understand how does the process flow. It works like this. When the process starts, when the start event is triggered, token is born and it travels through the sequence flow to start subsequent subprocesses or tasks. So it triggers check the form when the whole subprocess finishes, token continues and triggers task check the funds. Then it goes, since this execute gateway, either this or this way to trigger appropriate paths, and then when we reach the end, it is consumed and the life of process of so-called process instance finishes. Okay, here we have the simple BPMN diagram. Now what we may want to do is to extend it. So I told you that we may want to specify better connections between our participants. If we want to show that other participants somehow try to influence our process, we are using for this purpose message flow. This is the arrow with a small bubble at the end and white arrowhead with a dashed line. Please make sure that you don't make a very common mistake of people that just start with BPMN. Sequence flow cannot cross the boundary of a pool. So other participant cannot influence your process. Process is only controlled by participant that owns the pool. So only bank controls what happens inside. Other participants can only influence it by sending messages and hoping they will be considered. So in this case, this message flow could be transfer form. And here we could mark that we are sending some information for the customer. So here we could have information about insufficient funds. So this way you can very easily show how do our participants collaborate. Okay, now let's move a bit further. Sometimes we don't want to have very simple diagrams, but we want to have more meaning inside our diagrams. And here BPMN offers you many great possibilities. Most of the objects have various types, which allow you to have more meaning inside. So instead of having simple start event without any type, you can specify the trigger. So you could specify that this process starts when we receive some message, which obviously is the case. And then the process has the special envelope marker. You could specify that it starts when certain moment of time is reached, or when some condition is met, or when some signal, so something much broader than a message. Signal does not have a given receiver. It can be received by many participants. So here, by marking those triggers, you can very easily convey much more meaning about the process. In a very similar way, you can mark types of subprocesses. There are again various types. By default, this is simple embedded subprocess, which is just a rectangle with a plus marker. But you can also specify that you're calling not only the part of the process that was created for the purpose of clarity, but also you're calling some standard way of operating. This is so-called call activity, and it is marked with a thick border, with a thick line. There are also some other ways, but they're a bit more fancy. So I'll tell you only about one type, ad hoc. It allows you to specify various types of activities that you can take on the basis of your business knowledge of the situation. In a very similar way, you can also mark type of tasks. Here you could specify how is it done. The most useful types of tasks are the following. If something is done manually with no IT support, this is a manual task. And here you can see the hand icon. If this is something done by a person supported with some IT system, this is a user task. Well, user implies that the person is using the computer. Here you can see the small avatar icon. If something is done automatically, then this is a service task, marked with the cogwheels. So this way you can very easily mark what happens. Of course, again, there are more types. You can specify that your tasks either send some messages or receives them. For example, this task could be marked as send because it sends some message to the external participant. You could mark, but again, we have some standard way of working. This is a call activity with a fig border, or that we are using some standardized business rules. So those types allow you to have much more meaning inside your diagram. In a very similar way, you can have various types of gateways. For example, you could have gateway with marker or without it, or you could specify more advanced types. And this is something that we'll cover in the following webinars, not today. And you can also mark your end events. For example, this could be something that sends message to the customer. And here we would have the envelope icon. Okay, so this is how you normally approach modeling process. You start with very simple questions. So who are the participants? What is the perfect flow, perfect happy path of the process? What happens if something goes wrong? And then you extend the diagram. It is up to you to decide how deep in the details do you want to go. But as you could see, those are not complex, sophisticated elements. Those are the diagrams that everyone can understand, even without any specific BPMN training. So always understand why do you model, and always know your audience. If they are more IT-oriented, you may probably add more information. If they are business users or they're members of the board that just need to understand the overall vision of the process, probably you will be better off if you create much more simple diagrams. If you want to create more sophisticated diagrams, you may find useful various modes. By default, in a Adornings community, you start with the very simple way of modeling, which has only the most basic objects, the most basic attributes, which we'll see in a second. So here I have a task and only 3 chapters with attributes. But if you switch from the basic mode, so-called BPMN 2.0 Lite, to complete or version with all objects and all attributes, you will see that you have much more attributes that you can fill. So, as I told you, adjust what you're creating to your audience. If your audience needs more, you can add more information, but don't put in too much inside. So start with the basics and add options if needed. Good idea is to create your own set of elements, not to overload your users. Of course, it is very easy to add more advanced elements, something that I'll cover now, but you should decide which of them are really useful for you. Okay, now let's go to the second question. So what are the more advanced elements of BPMN and when you should use them? Well, the most useful elements that were not covered by me as of now are the intermediate events. While start events and end events mark, well, obviously, beginning and the end of a process, you can also show that something is happening inside the process. Some events take place during the flow, during the life of the process. And for this purpose, we are using intermediate events. They are marked with a double thin line. There are several types of intermediate events. Normally, you begin with intermediate events that are part of the process flow. So you simply add the object inside the flow, and then you need to specify what is its behavior. Intermediate events that are part of the process flow can either wait for something, so be so-called catching, or throw something, so be active. And again, you have some types. Not every type can be used with every trigger. So for example, while you may throw a message, so inform someone, or catch a message, so wait for information from someone till you can continue, obviously you cannot throw a time. You can just wait for a given time. So this way, you can show that your process needs to wait for a given moment of time. Or, for example, that you need to wait till you receive some message. Or that you need to wait till you receive some signal. For example, that your bank system is ready to perform the check. So this is something that allows you to show what happens inside your process, either actively, that you're doing something, that something happened, or passively, as catching events, when you mark that you need to wait till something happens. But this is only one type of intermediate events. There's also a second one. If you want to specify that something can go wrong and you handle it somehow, you can use intermediate events that are attached to boundaries of events. They're sometimes called boundary intermediate events. They can be used for error handling of various types. Let's imagine that during the check of the form, we noticed that the form is not complete, so that there are some missing information, or that the number of account is totally rubbish. So obviously we cannot continue with doing the check, with checking the funds and executing the transfer, because it simply will not work. We don't have account number. So to mark this, we simply add boundary event and specify what is the type. If this is something like an error, that was an error in IT system and we need to handle it, we are using the error trigger. Errors are always interrupting. So if during the check error happens, you need to stop doing what we are doing here and do something special. For example, I could say that if during the check of the form error in the content of the form was noticed, you need to inform the customer about the problem and finish the process. So ask the customer to start again. And here we would have yet another end event. Errors are used when something very, very hard, very technical takes place. Sometimes we don't have that difficult situation. We just want to specify that something happened that needs to be handled on a higher level. For this purpose, we are using so-called escalations. They have markers similar to Star Trek icon, something that shows up. So if inside escalation of problems with the form happens, we need to handle it somehow. Or we could say that if during the sub-process of checking the form, customer says, oh no, sorry, I forgot that I don't have sufficient funds, or sorry, I'm in a hurry, I cannot wait, please stop doing whatever you're doing. We could say that if we receive some message, we can either interrupt what we're doing. In this case, we're using this interrupting intermediate event boundary. Of course, it could also happen that during the check, customer either asks us about something or adds some information but does not interrupt the whole sub-process. In this case, we would have non-interrupting event. This is marked by a dashed line. Of course, it could also happen that if checking the form happens and during a specific time, for example, if it takes too long and we already reach 5 p.m. and the bank office needs to close, then something specific happens. So in this case, we could have timer. So as you can see, the types are more or less similar. So messages can be used here, here, here at the end events. So it is not that much things to learn. So those are the most useful ways of marking more information inside the diagrams. Those are the intermediate events. Of course, this is not everything that BPMN has to offer. There are much more types of sub-processes, there are much more types of events, but as I told you, it is something that I could tell you about for an hour. So today we'll finish by this introduction of the intermediate events, and next more advanced topics I can cover in the next coming sessions. Okay, so this was this one. One more thing about extending BPMN. Apart from adding more elements of more sophistication from the BPMN palette, you could also extend your BPMN, of course, in analysts by linking it with other processes. So you could link it with other processes and with other resources. You could specify, for example, document model or IT system model or model showing you responsibilities and organizational structure, and just link those elements. This is something that you can use to extend the built-in BPMN features. But again, this is something that I can cover in the next upcoming sessions. Okay. We have 8 more minutes, so let's switch to the Q&A part. Okay, I see 3 questions. Is Adonis MacBook compatible? Adonis Community Edition is Windows only application, so you need to either use some VMware or VirtualBox or something like this if you would like to use it on MacBook. But if you wish, if you just want to start working with BPMN and just experiment with it, you can also use our Adonis Cloud. So the solution that I told you about, available for 30 days of a free trial, it is, I think, more than sufficient to learn the basics of BPMN and just to play with it. And this is only browser-based, so you only need to have a browser that supports HTML5. So Firefox, Chrome, Internet Explorer 9, or more modern, so Any modern browser will do. Okay, will it be available as a download? I'm glad you like this session. I hope it will be useful for all of you. Well, this is my first time with Hangouts on Air. I sincerely hope that it will be available after the session. So if so, you will be able to see it on our page. If something goes wrong, we can set up a new session and do encore. So I hope that it will be available. Okay, question. Before 8 a.m. So thank you for joining us. It's such difficult hour for you. As I told, I'll hope that the recording will be available. I tried to configure Hangout on Air properly, but using Google technology for webinars is a bit new for me. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Okay, we have 6 more minutes, so if you have any more questions, just let me know and I'll be glad to answer. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'll just tell you a few words about the topics that I would like to cover during the upcoming sessions. I hope they'll be useful for you. As previously, I'll inform you about the webinar, asking to tell me what specific questions would you like me to cover. So I'll just answer the things that are relevant for you. The ideas that I have for the next sessions are extending BPMN with other model types. So this is something that can be done with analysts. This is then, of course, not the pure BPMN, but it is BPMN extended with other elements. So you could, for example, extend your diagrams assigning RACI responsibilities to the roles from the organizational structure. You can link your tasks with documents. Of course, as you probably know, BPMN offers you data objects that can mark which, emails, documents are used in the process, but this is not something capable of handling very complex processes with lots of documents. And if you're using this approach, you can very easily have dictionaries of document types and just mark which documents are used in which process steps. In a similar way, you could mark links between your process steps and products. Products are totally not covered in BPMN, so this is obviously out of scope for BPMN in a pure version. You can also mark how do your process steps use IT support. So for example, what are the applications, what are the services, maybe what hardware elements support your processes. BPMN to some extent allows you to mark it. The most common way to handle it is to use the data store objects just to simulate that this is some kind of IT application. But this is just a workaround because BPMN doesn't have anything much better for marking, visualizing those connections. But of course, you can do it like this. So the last tip is remember that BPMN contains many objects. Select only the elements relevant for you because the model is only a tool, something that should help you understand better your processes, improve them. So this is just a tool. Adjust it to your needs. In the next session, I can also cover process automation and how you can extend your diagrams to move them to automation and how you can share your diagrams with others using BPMN DI mechanism. I personally have a pleasure to work in so-called BPMN Model Interchange Working Group. This is a joint effort of vendors of BPMN tools, and we are working together to make sure that the diagrams that you create in one tool, for example in Adonis, can be moved to other tool, for example to automate it. or other way around, so that your colleague can create BPMN diagram in tool A, and then you can import it to Adonis using the BPMN DI mechanism. So this is very, very important because it allows you to escape from the vendor lock-in. You can use one tool, your colleagues can use other tool, but since you're using BPMN standard, you are free to collaborate without need to do some tweaks to your models. So those are the elements that I plan to cover during the next webinars. But of course, if you tell me that you would like me to cover other elements, I'll be glad to do so. Okay, it is already the hour. So I see one more question. Thank you for I'm glad you liked this learning session. Are there any other tutorials for new users of Adonis? Yes, of course. If you go to Adonis site, so adonis-community.com, there you can see webinars and tutorials, and there you can access, you can see the upcoming webinar, so this one that we are running currently, but also there is a list of Adonis on-demand webinars. And then you can see other more sophisticated aspects like process documentation, like doing process analysis and simulation, like advanced scenarios. This was a session about very, very deeper BPMN modeling, about moving from design to execution, so something that I just hinted, so that you can create your BPMN diagrams and then export them to automate them using other free tools, for example, like Bonita BPM. And there's also one session that I did last year about using APQC process classification framework reference models in Adonis. So I hope it will be helpful for you to understand better how you can use BPMN and Adonis for your business analyst purposes. I see one question. Performing a conversion of visual flow diagram to BPMN diagram is a good topic to consider. I think you may not notice that Adonis allows you to import visual diagrams. If you go to import-export, you have a special online converter that allows you to import your VDX files, and it converts them to BPMN diagrams. So I would suggest that you take a look and see how does it work for you. I hope it will work fine. Okay, it is already past the hour. Thank you very much for being with me today. I hope that our experimental way of working with Hangouts on Air worked for you nicely, and I hope that you will have much easier working with BPMN and Adonis afterwards. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Now I will try to finish the session, and let's hope that the recording will work. Bye-bye. Have a great day.